He was the god of prophecy, music, and the sun itself. Apollo, the golden archer, radiant and powerful, a deity accustomed to victory and adoration. He believed himself untouchable, his heart immune to the whims of lesser powers. But pride often precedes a fall, even for an Olympian. A careless word to Eros, the mischievous god of love, sealed his fate. In retaliation, 2 arrows were loosed, one of gold, to ignite an all-consuming passion, the other of lead, to create unyielding disgust. The target of his affection was Daphne, a nymph of the forest, a daughter of a river god who cherished her freedom above all else. What follows is not a story of romance, but of obsession. It is the tale of a relentless pursuit, a desperate flight, and a transformation that would forever bind the god to the one thing he could never possess. In the luminous pantheon of Olympus, few gods shone brighter than Apollo. He was the embodiment of the classical ideal, the god of music and poetry, of prophecy and healing, his form a perfect sculpture of divine grace. His lyre could charm the wildest beasts, and his knowledge of the future, dispensed through his oracle at Delphi, guided the fates of mortals and immortals alike. He was the bringer of light, the golden son of Zeus, a deity whose every action was imbued with precision, reason, and an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. This divine pride was never more apparent than after his monumental victory over the Python. This creature was no mere serpent. It was a primordial terror, a monstrous child of the earth goddess Gaia, its coils wrapped around the sacred center of the world at Delphi. Where chaos and darkness had reigned, Apollo brought order and light. With his gleaming silver bow, he unleashed a volley of arrows, each one finding its mark with unerring accuracy. The defeat of the Python was more than a heroic feat. It was a statement. It established Delphi as Apollo's own sanctuary and solidified his reputation as a peerless archer, a warrior whose skill was absolute. As the last echoes of the struggle faded, Apollo stood bathed in the glory of his triumph. The sun seemed to shine just for him, casting his perfect form in radiant gold. He held his silver bow, not just a weapon, but a symbol of his supremacy. In this moment, he was the master of precision, the conqueror of chaos. He believed his power was unmatched, his skill unchallengeable. This potent combination of achievement and adoration fostered a dangerous hubris within the sun god's heart. He began to see his bow as the ultimate instrument of power, and himself as its ultimate wielder. It was a belief that blinded him to other, more subtle forms of influence that existed in the cosmos. He walked away from Delphi convinced of his own invincibility, unaware that the greatest challenge to his power would not come from a monster of the earth, but from the seemingly insignificant flutter of a small, winged god's flight. His pride had set the stage for a fall, a lesson in humility that would be as painful as it was poetic. As Apollo basked in the afterglow of his victory, his path crossed with another archer, a god of a very different nature, Eros, the god of love. Known to some as Cupid, Eros was often depicted as a playful, winged youth, but his apparent innocence masked a power that was ancient and absolute. His was not the power of brute force or radiant light, but the irresistible, often chaotic force of desire. He could humble kings, inspire epic poems, and bring gods to their knees with a single, well-aimed shot from his small, golden bow. Apollo, his mind still filled with the grand scale of his own recent accomplishment, saw Eros toying with his bow and arrows, and could not resist a moment of condescension. A mocking smile touched the sun god's lips. "What is a child like you doing with such a warrior's weapon?" Apollo's voice, usually as harmonious as his lyre, was laced with dismissive pride. "Leave the bow to those with the strength to wield it. It is an instrument for mighty deeds, for felling great beasts like the python I have just vanquished. Your arrows are for trivial games." The insult struck Eros with more force than any physical arrow could. Apollo had not just belittled him as a child, he had trivialized his entire domain. He had dismissed the fundamental force of love as a mere game. The playful light in Eros's eyes hardened into a determined glint. He looked up at the towering, radiant god, and his voice was steady, holding a power far older than Apollo's youthful pride. "Your bow may conquer all other things, Apollo," Eros replied, "but my bow will conquer you." This was no longer a simple exchange of words. It was a profound clash of cosmic principles. On one side was Apollo, representing reason, order, and control. On the other was Eros, the agent of passion, obsession, and the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of the heart. The sun god, in his hubris, had failed to recognize that the passions of the heart could be far more dangerous than any monster. He laughed off the smaller god's warning, turning away without a second thought. But Eros did not forget. He flew to a high peak, his mind set on delivering a lesson. He reached into his quiver, his purpose clear. He would show the brilliant god of reason just how powerless he truly was against the forces he so foolishly disdained. Eros's revenge was to be a masterpiece of cruel artistry. From his quiver, he drew 2 arrows, each crafted for a specific and opposing purpose. The first was a thing of beauty, wrought from the purest gold, its tip honed to a needle-sharp point. It was designed not to wound the body, but to ignite the soul with an unquenchable fire, an immediate and all-consuming love for the first living thing the victim saw. This was the arrow he reserved for the god of light. Apollo, meanwhile, went about his divine duties, his mind untroubled by the memory of his encounter with Eros. He was still the master of his own universe, the embodiment of self-control and rational thought. He moved through the world with the easy grace of a god who had never known the madness of unrequited longing, a stranger to the very concept of desperation. He was a perfect, unsuspecting target. From his perch, Eros drew his golden bow. The string pulled taut, and with a silent release, the arrow of obsession began its journey. It flew like a tiny sunbeam, an imperceptible streak of light on its way to rewrite the very essence of a god. The arrow found its mark, striking Apollo's heart. The impact was not physical, but metaphysical. In an instant, the cool, rational core of the sun god was vaporized. A white-hot wave of emotion, an emotion he had never experienced, surged through him. It was not a gentle affection or a budding romance. It was a divine compulsion, a magical sickness of the soul. His celebrated reason vanished, replaced by a singular, overwhelming need. His pride, his music, his prophecies, all became meaningless echoes in the thunderous beating of his own heart. He was no longer a god in control. He was a being utterly enslaved by a newly born passion. And then, through the dense green of the forest, he saw her. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the wood nymph Daphne. In that precise moment, the formless burning energy that had seized him found its focus. The curse was sealed. Every fiber of his being, every ounce of his divine power, was now oriented toward a single goal. He must have her. The god of light had been plunged into the shadow of obsession, and his relentless pursuit was about to begin. Eros's plan was one of perfect, tragic symmetry. As the golden arrow reshaped Apollo's soul into a crucible of desire, the god of love reached for its counterpart. This second arrow was the antithesis of the first. It was not bright and gleaming, but dull, heavy, and tipped with lead. Its purpose was just as potent, but its magic was one of cold negation. It was designed to fill a heart with revulsion, to make the very idea of love, and specifically the love of the pursuer, an unbearable burden. This arrow was destined for Daphne. The nymph was moving through the forest, her natural home. She was a creature of the wild, as free as the streams and the wind. She was entirely unaware of the divine drama unfolding, innocent of the quarrel that had sealed her fate. She knew nothing of Apollo's newfound obsession or the role she was about to play in a god's bitter lesson. The leaden arrow flew, a dull gray streak against the vibrant green of the woods, and struck her heart. For Daphne, the effect was a sudden, chilling weight. A cold dread seeped into her spirit, extinguishing the warmth of the sunlit forest. It was an unnatural feeling, a magical aversion that settled deep within her. The very thought of a suitor, of a romantic advance, became abhorrent. And when she looked up and saw the radiant god Apollo striding toward her, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen, this feeling coalesced into a powerful, instinctual panic. This was the genius of Eros's cruelty. He had not simply made Apollo love someone who did not love him back. He had created an engine of perpetual torment. The two arrows were magically linked. The stronger Apollo's love grew, fueled by the golden arrow, the more potent Daphne's repulsion would become, amplified by the leaden one. Every impassioned word from Apollo would only strengthen her resolve to escape. Every step he took toward her would increase her desperate need for distance. He was fire, and she was ice, and the closer he came, the more she would instinctively recoil. She looked at the approaching god and saw not his beauty or his power, but a terrifying threat to her freedom. The leaden arrow's magic coursed through her, and her heart, once simply independent, was now a fortress of absolute rejection. To fully comprehend the tragedy of Daphne's flight, one must understand that the leaden arrow did not create a new sentiment within her. It merely weaponized a conviction she already held dearer than life itself, her freedom. Daphne was not a passive figure in this drama. She was a nymph of fierce independence, a daughter of the river god Peneus, and a spirit of the untamed wilderness. Her identity was intrinsically linked to the forests she roamed, the streams she followed, and the wild autonomy she cherished. She was a devout follower of Artemis, the eternal maiden, goddess of the hunt and the moon. For women in the ancient world, Artemis represented a powerful choice, a life of self-determination, free from the obligations of marriage and the dominion of men. To follow Artemis was to take a vow of chastity, not as a rejection of life, but as an embrace of a different kind of life, one of strength, skill, and absolute personal liberty. This was the path Daphne had chosen. Her father, like many fathers, wished for her to marry. He spoke of noble suitors, of powerful alliances, and of the grandchildren he hoped to one day hold. But Daphne consistently refused. For her, the institution of marriage was a cage, however gilded. It meant sacrificing her wild runs through the forest for the confines of a home, trading her bow for domestic duties. She pleaded with her father to grant her this one desire, to let her remain as she was, forever unwed, a companion to the wild and a follower of the virgin goddess. Seeing the unshakable conviction in her eyes, Peneus had reluctantly consented. Therefore, the leaden arrow acted as a powerful catalyst. It took her philosophical commitment to freedom and transformed it into a visceral, magical imperative. Her reasoned choice became an instinctual revulsion. Her cherished independence became a desperate, physical need to escape any form of capture. When she saw Apollo, she did not see the handsome, celebrated god of poetry and light. She saw the ultimate threat to her vow, the living embodiment of the life she had fought so hard to refuse. He was the suitor her father had wished for, the force that would end her wild existence. Her vow, now supernaturally charged by Eros's magic, screamed a single, deafening command in her soul: run. As Apollo took his first step, his voice calling her name like music, Daphne turned her back on the god and fled into the deepening shadows of the woods. The air in the ancient forest was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, a sanctuary untouched by the clamor of the mortal world. It was here that Apollo, the god of light and reason, chose to walk. He was still radiating the pride of his recent triumph, having vanquished the great serpent Python at Delphi. In his mind, he was invincible, a golden deity whose power was absolute and unquestioned. He moved with a languid grace, his divine presence a stark contrast to the wild, untamed nature surrounding him. His thoughts were of order, prophecy, and the perfect harmony of his lyre. He believed the universe bent to his will, that every note he played found its place in a grand, cosmic symphony of his own design. Then he saw her. Through a sun-dappled clearing, a figure moved with the fluid grace of a deer. It was Daphne, a nymph of the woods, a huntress devoted to the goddess Artemis. She was not a creature of quiet streams or gentle meadows. There was a fierce energy about her. Her hair was bound back for the practicalities of the hunt. Her arms were strong, and her gaze was sharp, constantly scanning the forest for prey. She embodied the very freedom of the wilderness she called home. In that instant, an unseen force struck the god. A golden-tipped arrow, fired from the bow of a mischievous Eros, found its mark in Apollo's heart. It was not a wound of the flesh, but of the soul. An immediate, overwhelming, and entirely irrational obsession seized him. The calm, collected god of logic was gone, replaced by a being consumed with a singular, burning need. His rationality evaporated like morning mist, and all his divine attributes, all his grand accomplishments, felt hollow and meaningless next to the sudden, desperate desire to possess the nymph before him. He, who could divine the future for all of mankind, had been utterly blinded to his own fate. He was the master of harmony, yet his own heart was thrown into a wild and frantic discord. The great victor of Delphi was now a captive, ensnared not by a monster of the earth, but by a single, fleeting glance. Daphne, sensing a new and unwelcome presence, paused. She turned, her sharp eyes meeting the god's intense golden gaze. In that moment, she felt no admiration, no awe. She felt only the cold premonition of a cage, a primal instinct that this divine attention was not a blessing, but a profound threat to the very essence of her being. Her freedom was in peril, and she knew it, and the silent tension in the clearing shattered. For Daphne, the god's stare was not one of admiration, but of acquisition. Instinct, honed by countless hours in the wild, took over. Without a second thought, she turned and fled. The forest, which had always been her sanctuary and her accomplice, now became the stage for a desperate flight for her life and her liberty. Her feet, sure and swift, barely seemed to touch the mossy ground as she darted between ancient trees, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Apollo, momentarily stunned by her immediate rejection, quickly recovered. A chase was not what he had envisioned, but his obsession would not permit him to let her go. He followed, his divine speed easily matching her panicked pace. "Do not run from me!" His voice boomed through the trees, a sound both beautiful and terrifying. He intended his words to be reassuring, to halt her with the sheer magnificence of his presence. But to Daphne, they were the calls of a predator closing in. He began to list his credentials, his voice laced with an arrogant disbelief that she would dare to flee. "I am no common shepherd, no rustic brute. I am Apollo, the lord of Delphi, master of the lyre, the bow, and the art of healing." Each declaration was meant to impress her, to make her see the honor he was bestowing upon her with his attention. He could not comprehend her fear. Why would anyone run from the god of music and light, the being who could offer poetry, prophecy, and protection? His pursuit was, in his mind, a gift. He was offering her a place at his side, a connection to the divine. But his godly ego blinded him to the truth. For Daphne, every one of his attributes was another link in a chain he intended to forge around her. His mastery of the bow meant he was a hunter. His command of prophecy meant a future she did not choose. His divine status meant a power she could never hope to defy. The pursuit was therefore more than a physical race. It was a fundamental clash of two opposing wills. His all-consuming desire for possession collided with her unyielding need for independence. The farther she ran, the more determined he became, his wounded pride fueling the fire of Eros's arrow. The initial distance between them, which had seemed a safe buffer, began to shrink with alarming speed. The god was relentless. Daphne could feel his presence like a heat at her back, his shadow stretching long and menacing over her path. The initial spark of alarm now blazed into pure, unadulterated terror. The forest became a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown, the world reduced to the path ahead and the sound of pursuit behind. The air burned in Daphne's lungs, but she dared not slow. Apollo, now running almost beside her, changed his tactic. His voice, no longer booming with authority, softened into a desperate, pleading tone that was carried on the wind, reaching her ears whether she wanted it to or not. The arrogant pronouncements of his divinity gave way to a frantic bargaining, a stream of promises meant to halt her flight. "Stay, gentle nymph," he cried out, his words weaving through the trees. "You do not know who you flee from. It is for that reason you flee." He tried to soothe her fears, assuring her that his intentions were honorable. He was not some beast of the wild, but a refined and powerful deity. He spoke of the great renown he would bring her. Her name, he promised, would be sung in poems for eternity. The trees of the forest would whisper her story, guided by his divine influence. He offered her a world beyond her imagination, a life of splendor among the immortals on Mount Olympus. He spoke of his temples, of the reverence he commanded from mortals, and of the secrets of the cosmos that he alone understood. He would share it all with her. In his mind, he was offering her the greatest prize in existence, himself. His words, however, revealed a profound and tragic lack of understanding. He failed to see that the very things he offered, immortality, fame, a shared divinity, were precisely what she was running from. To her, his promises were not of a shared glory, but of a gilded cage. To be Apollo's consort was to cease being Daphne, the free huntress of the woods. It was an erasure of her identity, a complete surrender of her autonomy. His pleas became tinged with an increasing frustration, his divine pride deeply wounded by her continued rejection. How could she, a mere nymph of the woods, deny him? He, who was desired by goddesses and mortals alike, was being spurned. This was an affront he could not comprehend. Daphne heard his words, but they did not register as a lover's plea. They were the arguments of a captor, the justifications of a will intent on breaking hers. She risked a fleeting glance over her shoulder. The face she saw was no longer the serene, beautiful countenance of the god of light. It was twisted with a desperate, obsessive need, an expression that confirmed her deepest fears. There would be no reasoning with this force. He would never stop. The chase had devolved into a raw, primal struggle. For Daphne, every fiber of her being was focused on a single imperative: escape. She pushed her body far beyond its mortal limits, fueled by a potent combination of adrenaline and sheer terror. Her lungs felt as if they were on fire, and every muscle screamed in protest, but she could not stop. To stop was to surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. The forest, once her ally, now seemed to conspire against her. Low-hanging branches clawed at her, tearing at her simple tunic and scratching her skin. Thorns snagged at her legs, trying to hold her back. Her unbound hair, once a symbol of her wild freedom, now streamed behind her like a silken banner, a beautiful, flowing target for her pursuer. She felt the wind, a force she had always loved, turn against her. Instead of cooling her, it seemed to press her garments against her body, revealing her form to the god's relentless gaze, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. This was a race of senses. She could feel the jarring impact of the hard earth and sharp stones through the thin soles of her sandals. She could hear the terrifyingly rhythmic sound of Apollo's footsteps, impossibly close, a steady drumbeat signaling her impending capture. She could almost feel the warmth radiating from his body, a suffocating heat that promised not comfort, but consumption. Her mind raced, replaying the vows she had made to the goddess Artemis, a sacred oath of eternal maidenhood and independence. That vow was not merely a promise, it was the core of her identity. It was the freedom to roam the forests alone, to rely on her own strength and skill, to be beholden to no one, god or mortal. This chase was the ultimate test of that vow. Apollo did not just want her affection, he wanted to own her, to tame her, to make her wild spirit a reflection of his own glory. She was no longer just running from an unwanted suitor. She was running from a future that would annihilate her sense of self. Each stride was an act of defiance, each ragged breath a testament to her will to remain unbroken. She could feel him closing in, the space between them shrinking to almost nothing. His breath was hot on her neck. His outstretched hand was just inches from her shoulder, the tips of his fingers about to graze her skin. The forest ahead began to thin, and through the trees she saw the shimmering surface of water. A flicker of a final, desperate hope ignited within her. It was the river. Her father's river. The riverbank was now just yards away. For Daphne, it was the end of the line, a final sanctuary, a last court of appeal. The relentless pursuit had reached its terrifying, unavoidable climax. Her strength was gone, her legs felt like lead, and the last of her energy was draining away with every frantic heartbeat. Apollo, sensing his victory was imminent, made one final, divine surge. He was the god of light, a being of immense power and speed, faster than any mortal creature, swifter than the east wind that heralds the dawn. In his mind, the chase was already over. He savored the impending moment of triumph, the feeling of finally catching the wild nymph who had dared to defy him. He did not see her as a person filled with terror, but as a prize to be won, a beautiful object that would soon be his. He imagined his arms closing around her, the end of her struggle, the beginning of her new life as his own. From Daphne's perspective, these last few seconds stretched into an eternity. Time itself seemed to slow to a crawl. She saw the familiar glittering water of the river Peneus, the gnarled roots of the trees that lined its banks, the smooth gray stones of the shore. She knew with chilling certainty that she could not outrun him. Her physical body had failed her. His hand was about to close upon her shoulder. With the very last of her strength, she stumbled towards the water's edge. Her voice, ragged and broken, cried out a prayer. It was not a plea for more speed or for a hidden path to escape. It was a prayer for something far more drastic, far more permanent. She called out to her father, the river god Peneus, begging him to save her from her pursuer. "Father, help me," she cried. "If your rivers have divine power, change me. Destroy this beauty that has brought me such distress." She was willing to sacrifice the very form that had attracted the god's obsessive desire, if it meant preserving her freedom. As Apollo's fingers finally brushed against her skin, a strange and heavy numbness began to creep up from her feet. The soft earth of the riverbank seemed to grasp her ankles, holding her fast. She could no longer move. Her desperate flight was over, but not in the triumphant way Apollo had envisioned. A profound and irreversible change had already begun. The chase had transcended mere pursuit. It had become a hunt in its purest, most primal form. Apollo, the god of light and reason, was now consumed by a singular, irrational obsession. The golden arrow of Cupid had not just inspired love, it had ignited a fire that burned away his divine composure, leaving only the raw, relentless drive of a predator. Every stride was powered by cosmic certainty, the belief that his desire was a universal law. He was a god, and what god is ever denied? Opposite him, Daphne, the sworn follower of Artemis, was no stranger to the hunt. She had tracked beasts through these same woods, her senses sharp, her body a vessel of speed and stamina. But now, the roles were cruelly inverted. The forest, once her sanctuary and proving ground, had transformed into a terrifying maze. Every familiar path seemed to lead back to her pursuer. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of his approach. Her lungs burned, a fire of a different kind, one of desperation and exhaustion. Her legs, though strong, were beginning to fail her. She was a mortal, and he was a god whose endurance was infinite. As the distance between them shrank, Apollo's voice echoed through the trees. It was not the voice of a gentle suitor, but of an entitled deity demanding his due. He called out his titles, weaving them into a tapestry of intimidation and promise. He was the Lord of Delphi, the master of the lyre, the bringer of healing, the seer of all futures. He promised her glory, a place by his side, a life of unimaginable splendor. To him, these were irresistible gifts. To Daphne, they were chains. Each title, each boast of his power, only magnified her terror. This was not a man she could reason with or dissuade. This was an elemental force, a radiant power that threatened to consume her very being, to erase the independent self she had fought so hard to protect. She could feel his presence now, not just hear it. It was a warmth on her back, a shift in the air, the palpable energy of a sun god closing in. The chase had lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it was now a matter of moments. Her final reserves of strength were gone. The hunter was upon his prey. Bursting through a final thicket of trees, Daphne found her path abruptly blocked. Before her lay the wide, shimmering expanse of a river, its currents flowing steadily through the ancient landscape. This was not just any body of water. It was the domain of her father, the river god Peneus. For a fleeting moment, the sight brought a new wave of panic. She was trapped. But as Apollo's triumphant shout echoed from the trees behind her, panic gave way to a final, desperate resolve. This was her last sanctuary, her final court of appeal. Sinking to her knees on the soft, damp earth of the riverbank, she turned her face not towards the sky, but towards the water. Her prayer was not a whisper, but a cry torn from the very depths of her soul. In Greek mythology, river gods are not distant Olympians. They are primordial, chthonic forces, deeply intertwined with the land they inhabit. They are the lifeblood of the earth, embodying a power that is older and more elemental than that of the shining gods of Olympus. Daphne's appeal was to this ancient power, a plea from a daughter to her father, from a creature of the wild to the source of its life. The words of her prayer, immortalized by the poet Ovid, reveal the totality of her desperation. She did not ask for rescue, for a shield, or for the power to fight back. Her request was far more radical, far more absolute. "Help me, Father," she cried. "If your waters hold divine power, then change me. Destroy this beauty which has brought me nothing but this unwanted attention." It is a staggering plea. She asks for the annihilation of her own form, the very identity that defined her. She is willing to sacrifice her face, her limbs, her humanity itself, to preserve her freedom. This was not a choice between capture and escape, but between existence as an object of desire and non-existence as she knew it. As she spoke, She could feel the heat of Apollo's presence directly behind her. His hand was reaching for her shoulder, the final touch that would signal her capture. Her prayer ended on a final, frantic gasp as his fingers were about to make contact. The moment Apollo's fingers brushed the fabric on Daphne's shoulder, the world seemed to hold its breath. The frantic sounds of the chase, the pounding feet, the ragged breathing, the rustling leaves, all fell silent. A profound stillness descended upon the riverbank, a quiet so deep it was almost a sound in itself. The prayer had been heard. The ancient power of the river god, Peneus, was stirring. For Daphne, the first sensation was not relief, but a strange and sudden heaviness. A deep torpor, a leaden numbness, began to creep into her limbs, starting with her feet. The burning ache of exhaustion was replaced by a cold, unfeeling weight, as if she were suddenly made of stone. She tried to take one last step, to pull away from Apollo's touch, but her legs would not obey. They felt alien, disconnected from her will. This was not a magical flash or a clap of thunder. The god's answer was slow, deliberate, and inexorable. It was the magic of the earth itself, patient, silent, and absolute. Apollo, poised for his moment of triumph, froze in confusion. The vibrant, trembling nymph he had been about to seize was becoming strangely rigid in his grasp. He saw the look of alarm on her face transform into a distant, placid expression. The change was subtle at first, a stiffening of her posture, a glazing of her eyes. He had spent the entire chase focused on her form, her speed, her beauty. Now, that very form was changing before his eyes, dissolving into something he could not comprehend. His divine intellect, which could foresee the destinies of mortals and nations, was utterly baffled. He had anticipated every outcome, her surrender, her continued flight, even her defiance, but not this. Not a fundamental alteration of reality itself. The transformation began to accelerate. The numbness spread up her body, a quiet tide of change that was both a rescue and an erasure. Her struggle ceased, replaced by an unnerving passivity as the will of her father asserted itself. Apollo took a step back, his hand falling away from her. The prize he had pursued with such relentless fervor was slipping through his fingers, not by escaping, but by becoming something else entirely. He was no longer a hunter cornering his quarry. He was a powerless witness to a miracle he could neither control nor understand. The transformation began from the ground up, a testament to its earthen origins. The nymph's feet, which had carried her so swiftly over moss and stone, were the first to surrender their form. The skin on her toes and ankles thickened, darkened, and began to split. But this was not an injury. It was a genesis. From these splits, pale, questing tendrils emerged, burrowing with surprising speed into the rich, dark soil of the riverbank. They were roots, anchoring her to the spot with a permanence she had never known. The very source of her flight, her speed and agility, was being systematically dismantled and replaced with its opposite, absolute immovability. As the roots dug deeper, securing her to her father's domain, the change ascended. Her strong, athletic legs, which had powered her desperate escape, began to merge. The space between them filled, and her lower body smoothed into a single, solid column. The texture of her skin changed, losing its human softness and taking on the rough, fibrous quality of wood. This was the birth of a trunk, a solid foundation connecting her to the earth. The symbolism is profound and layered. In her desperate prayer, Daphne had asked for the destruction of her form. Her father granted this, but in a way that was also a form of preservation. He was not destroying her, but remaking her into something that could not be pursued, could not be captured, could not be forced to submit. He traded her freedom of movement for a freedom from harassment. She was becoming a permanent, unassailable part of the landscape she loved. Her identity as a dynamic, living creature of motion was being overwritten by a new, static existence. The transformation continued its relentless climb, the solid wood moving up past her waist and enveloping her torso. Apollo could only watch, his godly powers rendered impotent. He could command the sun, inspire prophecies, and bring plagues, but he could not halt this slow, quiet, and powerful magic of the earth. The woman he desired was vanishing, and in her place stood a new creation, something both familiar and utterly alien. She was still Daphne, yet she was no longer Daphne at all. The final, delicate stages of the metamorphosis unfolded with a quiet grace. The soft skin of Daphne's arms and chest, the very surface that had reflected the forest light and inspired Apollo's maddening pursuit, began to change. A thin, tender sheath of green and brown spread across her, hardening as it grew. It was bark, a protective armor that sealed her away from the world and from him. Her slender arms, which she had thrown up in a final, desperate plea, stretched upwards and outwards. Her fingers elongated, branching into delicate twigs. The transformation was erasing every trace of her human form, replacing it with the elegant architecture of a tree. Her hair, which had streamed behind her like a dark banner during the chase, underwent the most beautiful change of all. It lifted in the gentle breeze, and as it did, each strand broadened, flattened, and took on the shape of a pointed, glossy leaf. A soft rustling sound replaced the silence, the first whisper of the new life she had become. She was now a laurel tree, slender and graceful, her new leaves shimmering in the sunlight. In the final moments, as her human consciousness faded, what were her thoughts? Was there a sense of profound relief, a feeling of ultimate safety in her new, unmoving form? Or was there a flicker of regret for the life of motion and freedom she had lost? The myth remains silent on this point, leaving us to contemplate the ambiguous nature of her salvation. Apollo, stunned into inaction, finally moved. He stepped forward, not with the arrogance of a pursuer, but with the tentative reverence of a mourner. He reached out and placed his hand upon the newly formed trunk. The wood was still warm. Beneath the rough bark, he could feel the faint, fading pulse of her heart, a final, fleeting echo of the life that had just been there. He pressed his lips to the wood, but the tree recoiled from his kiss. The chase was over. He had finally caught her, but his victory was hollow. He held nothing. The vibrant, living nymph was gone, replaced by this silent, wooden monument to his failure. In that moment of complete loss, his obsessive desire transformed into an eternal, sorrowful devotion. He had lost the woman, but he would consecrate the tree. The air burned in Daphne's lungs. Behind her, the footfalls of the god were no longer distant thunder, but the immediate, terrifying beat of a predator closing in. The river Peneus, her father's domain, shimmered ahead, a sanctuary just beyond her grasp. She could feel Apollo's breath on her neck, his shadow falling over her, extinguishing the last of her hope. His hand was about to close around her shoulder. In that final, desperate moment, with all strength for flight expended, she sent a frantic prayer not to the heavens, but to the earth and water that gave her life. "Father, help me," she cried, her voice ragged. "If your waters hold divine power, change me, destroy the beauty that has brought me this torment." The plea had barely left her lips when a strange heaviness seized her limbs. Her frantic sprint slowed to a halt, not from fatigue, but from a profound and unnatural stillness. Her feet, which had pounded the forest floor, suddenly felt anchored, sending tendrils deep into the soft earth. A rough, protective sheath began to creep up her legs, her smooth skin hardening into bark. Apollo watched, his triumphant grasp faltering into bewildered awe. He saw her arms, raised in supplication, lengthen and stiffen into branches. Her hair, which had streamed behind her like a silken banner, sprouted into a canopy of delicate green leaves. Her heart, which had hammered with terror, was now encased in wood, its frantic beat slowing to the patient, silent pulse of a tree. She was gone. In her place stood a magnificent laurel, the first of its kind, its leaves trembling in the breeze that had once cooled her skin. The god stood frozen, his prize won and lost in the same instant. He reached out, not to seize a nymph, but to touch the rough bark of a tree. He pressed his hand against the trunk, trying to feel the warmth of the woman he had pursued, but found only the cool, impassive surface of the wood. Yet, beneath the bark, he could still feel a faint, residual trembling, the last echo of the terrified heart of the nymph he had so relentlessly hunted. The forest fell silent. The frantic sounds of the chase, the pounding feet, the ragged breaths, were replaced by the gentle rustle of new leaves. For Apollo, the silence was deafening. He, the god of light, prophecy, and reason, stood in the shadow of his own failure. His divine power, which could heal the sick and see the future, had been utterly useless. He had driven the object of his affection to choose an eternity as a tree over a moment in his arms. A profound and unfamiliar sorrow washed over him, a grief that even a god could not rationalize away. He had not merely been rejected, he had been the catalyst for an irreversible transformation, a permanent erasure of the being he desired. Leaning against the trunk of the laurel, he spoke to it, his voice filled with a new, somber reverence. "Since you can never be my bride," he declared, his words echoing through the quiet grove, "you shall at least be my tree." He made a solemn vow, not just to the transformed nymph, but to the cosmos itself. "My lyre and my quiver will be adorned with your leaves. Your branches will crown the heads of the great Roman generals when they ride in triumph. Your leaves will be woven into wreaths for the brows of poets and the victors of the games held in my honor." In that moment, Apollo elevated the laurel from a simple tree into a sacred symbol. He promised it eternal spring. Its leaves would never wither or fade. Through his divine will, Daphne, who had sought only to escape him, would now be forever associated with him. Her physical form would be a constant presence in his temples, her essence a part of his identity. This act was both a tribute and a form of possession. It was his attempt to transform his painful loss into a legacy of glory, to turn the symbol of his personal defeat into a public emblem of the highest human achievement. He could not have the nymph, so he would claim her new form, binding her to his story for all time. Imagine the scene. A victorious Roman general parades through the streets of the capital, the adoring roar of the crowd washing over him. Upon his head rests not a crown of gold, but a simple wreath of dark green leaves. This is the corona triumphalis, the laurel crown, the highest honor a mortal could achieve. It is a symbol of unparalleled success, of power, of glory. Yet, this ultimate emblem of victory is rooted in the story of a god's most profound personal failure. The tradition began not in Rome, but in Greece, at the Pythian Games held at Delphi. These games, celebrated in Apollo's honor, were second only to the Olympics. The prize for the victors was not a material reward, but a laurel wreath cut from a sacred grove. To be crowned with laurel was to be touched by the god himself, to be granted a glory that transcended mere wealth. This tradition, steeped in divine honor, was eagerly adopted by the Romans. They saw in the laurel's evergreen nature a symbol of enduring victory and eternal fame. Emperors from Augustus to Constantine were depicted wearing laurel wreaths, signifying not just military prowess, but a divine right to rule. The symbol became so powerful that its origins were almost forgotten by the masses. For the world, the laurel meant achievement. For Apollo, it was a constant, bittersweet reminder. Every time a hero was crowned, Every time a poet wore the wreath, the god was forced to relive his loss. The leaves that rested on the victor's brow were the very same leaves that had once been Daphne's hair. He had succeeded in making her famous, in granting her a form of immortality she never asked for. But in doing so, he had created a paradox, a symbol of public triumph that was, for him alone, an eternal monument to unrequited love and the sorrow of a prize forever out of reach. The weight of the laurel crown was not just in its glory, but in the silent, tragic story woven into every leaf. Frozen in time, in a Roman gallery, a young woman's fingers blossom into leaves. Her body arches away from the god who grasps her, her face a mask of desperation as bark encases her legs. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, a masterpiece of Baroque sculpture that captures the myth's climactic moment with breathtaking intensity. For centuries, the story of the god and the nymph has been a powerful muse, a wellspring of inspiration for artists seeking to explore the dramatic heights of human emotion. Bernini's sculpture is perhaps the most famous interpretation. He freezes the chase at its most dynamic point, the transformation itself. The viewer can almost feel Daphne's forward momentum being arrested as her toes sprout roots, the marble seeming to defy its own solid nature to become fluid and alive. But long before Bernini, painters of the Renaissance, such as Antonio del Pollaiuolo, depicted the raw energy of the chase itself, emphasizing the physical struggle and the wildness of the landscape. Later, pre-Raphaelite artists like John William Waterhouse would infuse the scene with a romantic, melancholic beauty, focusing on the nymph's ethereal grace and the god's handsome despair. The myth found its most enduring voice, however, in the written word. It was the Roman poet Ovid, in his epic Metamorphoses, who gave the story its definitive form. His narrative is not just a simple tale of pursuit, but a psychological drama, delving into the minds of both pursuer and pursued. Centuries later, the Italian poet Petrarch would reinvent the myth for his own time. His unrequited love for a woman named Laura became intertwined with the story of Apollo and the laurel, or lauro in Italian. The laurel became for him a dual symbol, of his beloved Laura and of the poetic glory he sought. For Petrarch and countless poets who followed, the pursuit of the elusive beloved became a metaphor for the artist's relentless, often frustrating, quest for inspiration and perfection. From stone to canvas to verse, the myth has been endlessly reinterpreted, each artist finding a new reflection of their own era's anxieties about love, art, and desire. For millennia, the story has been framed as a tragedy of unrequited love. But if we look past the poetry and the divine glamour, a more unsettling question emerges. Was Apollo's feeling for Daphne truly love? Or was it a dangerous obsession, born of wounded pride and divine entitlement? Viewing the myth through a modern lens shifts the narrative entirely. The story begins not with love, but with mockery. Apollo, arrogant after a recent victory, belittles Cupid, the god of desire. In retaliation, Cupid strikes him with a golden arrow of irresistible infatuation and strikes Daphne with a leaden arrow of absolute repulsion. Apollo's subsequent pursuit is therefore not organic affection, but a magically induced compulsion fueled by his own ego. He never stops to consider Daphne's feelings, her terror, her repeated cries for him to stop, her desperate flight, all are ignored. He sees her not as an individual with her own will, but as a prize he is entitled to. His pleas and promises are not aimed at winning her heart, but at ending the chase so he can claim his reward. From this perspective, Daphne's transformation is not a tragedy, but an act of ultimate agency. Faced with a pursuer who will not accept no for an answer, she makes a radical choice. She sacrifices her form, her very being as a nymph, to preserve her autonomy. she chooses to become an unmoving, unfeeling tree rather than submit to a will that is not her own. Her metamorphosis is the most powerful refusal possible. This rereading transforms the myth from a romantic tale into a profound and timeless commentary on consent and the nature of power. It highlights the critical difference between genuine love, which respects the freedom and identity of the other, and possessive desire, which seeks only to conquer and consume. Apollo's eternal vow to honor the laurel, then, takes on a new meaning. It is not just the act of a grieving lover, but the act of a god forced to confront the absolute limit of his power, forever bound to the symbol of a woman whose will ultimately proved stronger than his own.